AKASHA, the Universal Consciousness Field, by ADNAN, M.A., Thursday, 2 July 2026. Synopsis. This work explores one of humanity's oldest and most enduring questions: where does knowledge come from? Beginning with the ancient Hindu concept of AKASHA as the subtle principle of space, this thought-provoking work traces the remarkable evolution of the idea through the Theosophical movement, the emergence of the Akashic Record, and its modern reinterpretation as a universal field of consciousness. Written in a clear, secular, and intellectually rigorous style, it separates historical fact from philosophical speculation, enabling readers to understand how a classical Sanskrit concept became one of the most influential ideas in contemporary discussions of intuition and consciousness. Drawing on the writings of thinkers such as Helena Blavatsky and Deepak Chopra, the book examines the proposition that consciousness may access information beyond ordinary perception through focused attention and meditative stillness. It also compares the Akashic concept with modern ideas including distributed information, cloud computing, collective intelligence, predictive processing, neuroscience, and theories of consciousness, demonstrating why this ancient idea continues to resonate in the information age. Rather than asking readers to accept metaphysical claims, AKASHA, the Universal Consciousness Field, invites them to examine the concept critically, historically, and philosophically. Whether viewed as a literal feature of reality, a sophisticated metaphor, or an enduring model for understanding intuition, AKASHA offers a fascinating lens through which to explore the relationship between information, consciousness, and the human search for knowledge.
AKASHA, the Universal Consciousness Field. From ancient Hindu thought to modern intuitive understanding, the history of human thought is, in many respects, the history of humanity's attempt to answer a deceptively simple question: where does knowledge come from? Every civilization has grappled with this mystery. Is knowledge created entirely within the human brain, assembled from experience and reason? Or does consciousness sometimes gain access to information that appears to originate beyond ordinary perception? Throughout history, philosophers, mystics, psychologists, and scientists have proposed different answers. Some have argued that consciousness is merely a product of the physical brain, emerging from the intricate interactions of billions of neurons. Others have suggested that consciousness may be more fundamental than matter itself, that the human mind does not simply generate awareness but also participates in a much larger informational reality. Among the many concepts proposed to explain this possibility, few have enjoyed a longer or more remarkable history than AKASHA. Over thousands of years, the term has evolved from a philosophical concept in ancient India into a modern idea describing a universal field of consciousness containing information about every event, every thought, and every possibility. Today it appears in discussions ranging from meditation and intuition to consciousness studies and systems theory. Whether one accepts these ideas literally, metaphorically, or not at all, the concept of AKASHA occupies an important place in the intellectual history of consciousness. It represents one of humanity's most enduring attempts to explain how information, intuition, and awareness may be connected. This chapter does not seek to establish whether the Akashic field exists as an objective feature of reality. Such claims lie beyond the reach of present scientific verification. Rather, the purpose is to understand how the idea developed, how it has been interpreted by different traditions, and why it continues to attract serious attention from those interested in the nature of consciousness. Doing so requires distinguishing carefully between several distinct traditions that are often conflated. The ancient Hindu concept of AKASHA is not identical to the Theosophical concept of the Akashic Record, nor is either precisely the same as the contemporary New Age understanding of a universal consciousness field. Although these ideas share a common vocabulary, they arose in different historical periods and address different philosophical questions. Only by tracing this evolution step by step can we understand what modern writers mean when they speak of accessing the Akashic Record or drawing information from universal consciousness. AKASHA in ancient Hindu thought. The Sanskrit word AKASHA has a long and distinguished history within Indian philosophy. It appears in Hindu scriptures dating back more than 2,000 years and occupies an important place in several schools of classical Indian thought. The term is often translated into English as space, although this translation captures only part of its meaning. Earlier English writers frequently rendered it as ether, reflecting the scientific vocabulary of the 19th century. Today, however, the word ether carries associations with obsolete physical theories and can create unnecessary confusion. A more accurate contemporary understanding is that AKASHA refers to the principle of space itself, the subtle dimension within which all physical existence becomes possible. In classical Hindu philosophy, the physical universe is traditionally described in terms of 5 fundamental elements, known collectively as the Pancha Mahabhuta, or the 5 great elements. These are earth, water, fire, air, and Akasha. To modern readers, this classification may appear primitive, but it should not be understood as an early attempt at chemistry or physics. The 5 elements are better regarded as philosophical categories describing different aspects of experience rather than literal chemical substances. Earth represents solidity and structure. Water symbolizes fluidity and cohesion. Fire represents transformation and energy. Air signifies movement and dynamism. Akasha, by contrast, represents the dimension within which all the other elements exist and interact. Unlike the other 4 elements, Akasha cannot be grasped directly through ordinary sensory experience. It possesses no shape, color, or tangible form. Instead, it functions as the all-encompassing medium that allows existence itself to unfold. Without space, nothing could occupy a location, movement would be impossible, and physical relationships could not exist. In this sense, Akasha is less an object than a condition of existence. Several schools of Hindu philosophy also regarded Akasha as the medium through which sound propagates. Long before modern acoustics, Indian philosophers associated sound with space, observing that sound requires a medium through which to travel. Consequently, Akasha came to be linked not merely with physical extension, but also with communication and vibration. This subtle association between space and vibration would later prove enormously influential in the evolution of the concept. It is important, however, not to read modern interpretations back into these ancient texts. The classical Hindu understanding of Akasha did not describe an infinite cosmic library containing every event in history or every future possibility. Nor did it portray Akasha as a repository of individual memories or universal information in the sense commonly found in contemporary New Age literature. Those ideas emerged much later. The ancient concept was primarily cosmological rather than informational. Akasha explained the existence of space as one of the fundamental principles underlying the universe. Although deeply philosophical, it was not presented as a database of cosmic knowledge. Recognizing this distinction is essential for understanding how the concept developed over time. Modern discussions often blur the boundary between the original Sanskrit idea and later interpretations, giving the impression that the Akashic Record has always been part of Hindu philosophy. Historically, this is not the case. Instead, the modern concept represents a remarkable reinterpretation that occurred many centuries later, when Eastern philosophical ideas encountered Western esoteric traditions during the 19th century. From philosophy to information, the evolution of Akasha reflects a broader pattern in the history of ideas. Concepts rarely remain fixed across centuries. As cultures interact, ideas are reinterpreted, expanded, and adapted to answer new questions. Ancient Indian philosophers were primarily concerned with understanding the structure of existence. Their discussions centered on the nature of reality, the relationship between consciousness and the material world, and the principles governing the cosmos. By the 19th century, however, intellectual priorities had begun to change. The scientific revolution had transformed humanity's understanding of the physical universe. At the same time, interest in comparative religion, psychology, and mysticism was growing rapidly throughout Europe and North America. Thinkers increasingly sought ways to reconcile scientific progress with enduring questions about consciousness, intuition, and spiritual experience. Within this intellectual climate, the ancient idea of Akasha acquired an entirely new significance. Rather than viewing Akasha simply as the principle of space, some writers began to imagine it as something far more expansive, a universal informational medium in which every event, every thought, and every experience might somehow be preserved. This transformation marked one of the most significant reinterpretations of an ancient philosophical concept in modern intellectual history. The development did not occur within classical Hinduism itself. Instead, it emerged through the work of 19th-century Western esoteric thinkers, who drew inspiration from Indian philosophy while combining it with ideas from Neoplatonism, occultism, and emerging theories about evolution and consciousness. The result was a new conception that would become known as the Akashic Record, an idea that would profoundly influence 20th century spirituality and, eventually, the modern understanding of universal consciousness. The story of that transformation begins with the founding of the Theosophical Society, where an ancient Sanskrit word would acquire an entirely new meaning and begin a second life in the modern world. From AKASHA to the Akashic Record, the transformation of AKASHA from a philosophical principle into a universal repository of information did not occur gradually over many centuries. Rather, it emerged within a specific historical context during the latter half of the 19th century. It was the product of an era in which Western intellectuals were becoming increasingly fascinated by Eastern religions, esoteric philosophy, and the possibility that science and spirituality might ultimately describe different aspects of the same reality. At the center of this development stood Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. In 1875, Blavatsky, together with Henry Steele Olcott and others, founded the Theosophical Society. The society sought to study comparative religion, philosophy, and science, believing that beneath the world's diverse religious traditions lay a common body of universal wisdom. To modern readers, this objective may appear ambitious, even idealistic. Yet it reflected the intellectual climate of the time. European scholarship had begun translating large numbers of Sanskrit, Pali, and Chinese texts. Ideas that had remained largely confined to Asia for centuries were suddenly becoming accessible to Western audiences. Theosophy did not simply adopt these ideas unchanged. It reinterpreted them through a distinctly Western esoteric framework. Hinduism, Buddhism, Neoplatonism, Hermetic philosophy, Gnosticism, and various occult traditions were woven together into an elaborate cosmology intended to explain the evolution of both humanity and consciousness. Within this synthesis, the Sanskrit concept of AKASHA acquired a dramatically expanded meaning. No longer was AKASHA understood merely as the subtle principle of space. It became the underlying medium through which every event occurring anywhere in the universe left a permanent imprint. Every thought, every action, every emotion, and every experience was believed to be recorded within this universal field. This was the birth of what later became known as the Akashic Record. The metaphor of a record is revealing. A record preserves information. It stores events so that they may later be retrieved. According to Theosophical teaching, the universe itself functions in precisely this manner. Reality continually records its own history, leaving nothing permanently lost. One immediately notices how different this concept is from the ancient Hindu understanding discussed in the previous section. Classical Hindu philosophy asked, "What is the nature of space?" Theosophy instead asked, "Could space itself preserve information?" This seemingly modest shift transformed the entire concept. A cosmic memory. The Akashic Record was not imagined as a physical library hidden somewhere in the cosmos. Rather, it functioned as a metaphor for a universal memory embedded within reality itself. Today we might compare this to the distinction between a filing cabinet and a cloud-based information network. A filing cabinet occupies a particular location. Information must be physically stored within it. A cloud network, by contrast, allows information to exist independently of any single device. The information remains accessible even though it is distributed throughout an interconnected system. Although this analogy depends upon modern technology unavailable to 19th century theosophists, it captures the conceptual shift remarkably well. The Akashic Record was imagined not as a place but as an informational substrate, a foundational level of reality in which all events become permanently encoded. This idea proved enormously attractive because it addressed questions that had occupied philosophers for centuries. If consciousness survives bodily death, where is memory preserved? If intuition sometimes reveals knowledge that appears impossible to acquire through ordinary means, where does that knowledge originate? If great creative insights seem suddenly to emerge fully formed, from where do they arise? The Akashic Record offered a single, explanatory framework capable of addressing all these questions simultaneously. Whether one accepts the explanation is a separate matter. What matters historically is that the concept provided an intellectually coherent model within the philosophical assumptions of theosophy. Reading the record. Once the idea of a universal record had been proposed, an obvious question followed. Could it be accessed? Within theosophical teaching, the answer was affirmative. Certain individuals were believed capable of perceiving portions of the Akashic Record through highly developed states of consciousness. These states were generally associated with meditation, disciplined mental training, or exceptional spiritual development. Importantly, this was not described as ordinary perception. One does not see the Akashic record in the same way one observes a landscape or reads a book. Rather, information was said to arise directly within consciousness itself. This distinction would later become central to New Age interpretations. Knowledge is not obtained through the senses. It is received through consciousness. This subtle shift moved the discussion away from supernatural spectacle and towards the psychology of awareness. Even among those sympathetic to such ideas, the emphasis gradually shifted from miraculous visions to intuition, insight, and expanded consciousness. The language became less theological and increasingly psychological. From esotericism to popular culture, during the 20th century, the concept escaped the relatively specialized world of theosophy and entered the broader landscape of Western spirituality. Numerous writers expanded upon the idea, often simplifying it for general audiences. The Akashic record gradually came to be described using increasingly accessible language. It became the universe's memory, the collective archive of human experience, the blueprint of every soul, the library of existence. Although these expressions differ in wording, they all describe essentially the same underlying concept. Reality contains information extending beyond the knowledge possessed by any individual human being. As the language evolved, explicit references to occult philosophy often disappeared altogether. Instead, writers increasingly borrowed concepts from psychology, systems theory, quantum physics, sometimes accurately, sometimes less so, and information science. The vocabulary changed. The central idea remained. The shift towards consciousness. Perhaps the most significant development occurred during the latter half of the 20th century. Rather than asking whether the universe contains an informational record, many writers began asking a different question. What if consciousness itself participates in that informational field? This marked an important conceptual transition. The Akashic record was no longer regarded merely as something external that exceptional individuals occasionally visited. Instead, consciousness itself became understood as inherently connected to this universal informational substrate. The implication was profound. If consciousness already participates in such a field, then intuition is not the acquisition of entirely new information. Rather, intuition becomes the conscious recognition of information that is, in some sense, already available. This idea would become one of the defining features of modern New Age philosophy. It also prepared the ground for writers such as Deepak Chopra, who sought to reinterpret these ideas using contemporary language drawn from medicine, neuroscience, psychology, and modern physics. The emphasis shifted once again. The question was no longer simply whether a universal record exists. The more intriguing question became whether the human mind possesses the capacity to tune itself to that universal informational field. It is this modern reinterpretation, less concerned with esoteric cosmology than with consciousness, intuition, and cognitive experience, that has shaped contemporary discussions of AKASHA and universal consciousness. The next chapter of this intellectual journey moves even further from 19th-century occultism, and towards a language that attempts, however controversially, to frame ancient metaphysical ideas using concepts drawn from information theory and modern science. Universal consciousness and the informational universe. By the closing decades of the 20th century, discussion of the Akashic record had undergone another significant transformation. The language of 19th-century occultism gradually gave way to a vocabulary that sounded more compatible with psychology, information theory, and modern science. Although the underlying concepts remained largely unchanged, they were expressed in terms that appealed to an audience increasingly familiar with neuroscience, quantum physics, and systems thinking. One of the most important developments during this period was the growing emphasis on universal consciousness. Unlike the traditional Theosophical view, which often portrayed the Akashic record as an objective cosmic archive that could occasionally be consulted, many contemporary writers proposed a more integrated model. Rather than imagining consciousness and the Akashic record as separate entities, they suggested that consciousness itself participates in a universal field of information. This subtle distinction changes the entire framework. In the earlier model, an individual seeks access to an external repository of knowledge. In the newer model, the individual mind is already embedded within that informational field. The challenge is not traveling to it, but becoming sufficiently receptive to perceive what is already present. This shift represents one of the defining characteristics of contemporary New Age thought. consciousness as a receiver. An analogy frequently employed by modern writers compares the human brain to a radio receiver. A radio does not create the music it plays. The broadcast already exists as electromagnetic signals permeating the surrounding environment. The radio merely converts those signals into sound. Likewise, some theories of consciousness propose that the brain does not generate consciousness in its entirety. Instead, it may function as a receiver, filter, or interpreter of a more fundamental field of awareness. This idea remains speculative. It is not an established scientific theory, nor is there empirical evidence demonstrating that consciousness literally functions in this manner. Nevertheless, it has proved to be a remarkably influential philosophical model because it offers an alternative way of thinking about intuition, creativity, and insight. Many people have experienced occasions when solutions to difficult problems appear suddenly and unexpectedly. A scientist struggles with an equation for weeks before the answer emerges during a walk. A composer awakens with an entire melody already formed. A novelist discovers that characters begin behaving in ways never consciously planned. A mathematician experiences an unexpected moment of clarity while engaged in an unrelated activity. Conventional neuroscience generally explains these events as the unconscious brain continuing to process information outside conscious awareness. Complex cognitive processes continue beneath the threshold of consciousness until a solution eventually reaches awareness. The universal consciousness model offers a different interpretation. Rather than viewing these moments solely as products of unconscious computation, it proposes that consciousness may occasionally gain access to information extending beyond ordinary mental processing. Whether this interpretation is correct remains an open philosophical question. Its significance lies less in its factual status than in the explanatory framework it provides for understanding intuition. Deepak Chopra's interpretation. Among the contemporary writers who have popularized this approach, Deepak Chopra occupies a distinctive position. Trained originally as a physician, Chopra has consistently attempted to present spiritual and philosophical ideas using language familiar to readers with scientific backgrounds. His work combines concepts drawn from medicine, psychology, Eastern philosophy, and modern physics into an integrated model of consciousness. One particularly illuminating example appears in his discussion of intuition. Rather than beginning with mystical experiences or religious revelation, Chopra starts with something far more familiar, the structure of the hydrogen atom. His purpose is not to teach atomic physics. Instead, he employs the atom as a conceptual illustration. Hydrogen, the simplest of all atoms, consists of a positively charged nucleus surrounded by an electron existing within a probability cloud. Although introductory diagrams often depict the electron orbiting the nucleus like a miniature planet, modern quantum mechanics describes the electron rather differently. It is more accurate to think in terms of regions of probability than fixed orbital paths. For Chopra's analogy, however, one aspect of the atom is especially important. The atom is overwhelmingly empty. To appreciate the scale involved, Chopra invites the listener to imagine enlarging the nucleus until it becomes approximately the size of an orange. If the nucleus were enlarged to this scale, the electron would be roughly the size of a pea located about 1 kilometer away. Between them would lie an immense expanse of apparent emptiness. The image is striking because it challenges ordinary intuition. Objects that appear solid are, at the atomic level, composed almost entirely of space. Our everyday experience of solidity arises not because matter is densely packed, but because electromagnetic forces prevent atoms from passing through one another. The apparent solidity of the world conceals an astonishing degree of internal spaciousness. Is empty space really empty? Here Chopra introduces his central philosophical proposition. He suggests that the space between atomic particles should not necessarily be regarded as mere emptiness. Instead, he proposes thinking of it as a domain containing information. This is an important point, requiring careful clarification. Modern physics does not describe empty space as literally empty. Quantum field theory, for example, recognizes that even a vacuum possesses measurable physical properties and fluctuating quantum fields. However, Chopra's discussion is not intended as an explanation of quantum field theory. Rather, he employs the apparent emptiness of atomic structure as a metaphor for a deeper informational reality. His argument is essentially philosophical. If the material universe is not as solid as everyday perception suggests, then perhaps information rather than matter occupies a more fundamental position in reality. Within this framework, the Akashic field becomes a useful conceptual model. Instead of imagining a mystical library hidden somewhere beyond the universe, one imagines an informational substrate underlying the universe itself. Matter becomes one expression of reality. Information becomes another. Consciousness, in turn, becomes the process through which that information may occasionally be accessed. Whether one accepts this interpretation is secondary. The important point is that Chopra has reframed the Akashic Record in a way that requires no appeal to supernatural imagery. Instead of celestial archives and invisible books, he speaks of information. Instead of miracles, he speaks of consciousness. Instead of mystical journeys, he speaks of intuition. The vocabulary changes profoundly, even though the underlying philosophical questions remain remarkably similar. This modern language has made the concept of AKASHA accessible to many readers who would never describe themselves as religious or even spiritual. They may reject supernatural explanations while remaining open to the possibility that consciousness possesses capacities not yet fully understood. It is at this point that Chopra introduces what is perhaps the most practical aspect of his model. If such an informational field exists, and if consciousness can in principle access it, how does one improve that access? His answer is unexpectedly simple. The instrument is not an external device. The instrument is the mind itself. The challenge, therefore, is not constructing a more sophisticated machine, but learning to use consciousness with greater precision. It is this transition from the nature of the informational field to the disciplined cultivation of attention that forms the next stage of the argument. There, Chopra replaces mystical language almost entirely with a discussion of focused attention, mental stillness, and the cognitive conditions under which intuition may emerge into conscious awareness. The mind as the instrument. If the Akashic field is conceived as an informational substrate underlying reality, an immediate question arises. How might such a field be investigated? Within conventional science, the answer would ordinarily involve the use of increasingly sophisticated instruments. Throughout history, our understanding of nature has advanced because new technologies have extended the reach of human perception. Telescopes revealed distant galaxies. Microscopes uncovered the cellular world. Particle accelerators exposed the constituents of matter. Each technological advance allowed phenomena previously beyond direct observation to become measurable. Chopra's argument takes a different direction. He suggests that if the informational substrate exists at a level more fundamental than ordinary physical interactions, then instruments constructed from matter may be intrinsically limited in their ability to investigate it. His reasoning is philosophical rather than experimental. Every scientific instrument is itself composed of atoms. Every measurement depends upon physical interactions between the instrument and the object being observed. If the Akashic substrate lies beneath, or is more fundamental than, those physical interactions, then conventional instruments may simply be the wrong tools for the task. Whether this conclusion is correct is open to debate. It is not a proposition established by contemporary physics, nor does it follow inevitably from atomic theory. Rather, it reflects Chopra's broader philosophical view that consciousness cannot be fully understood through material observation alone. Accepting this premise leads naturally to a different conclusion. If external instruments cannot access the informational field, perhaps the appropriate instrument is consciousness itself. This represents one of the defining ideas of modern contemplative traditions. The human mind is not merely the object of investigation. It is also the means of investigation. Meditation reconsidered. The word meditation often carries religious or mystical associations that can obscure its practical meaning. In recent decades, psychologists and neuroscientists have increasingly adopted more neutral expressions, such as focused attention, attentional training, and mental regulation. These terms describe meditation not as a religious practice, but as a disciplined method for cultivating particular states of awareness. Viewed in this way, meditation is less concerned with belief than with cognition. It is an exercise in learning how attention behaves. Most people discover, when they first attempt to sit quietly, that the mind is in almost continuous motion. Thoughts arise spontaneously. Memories intrude. Plans for the future appear uninvited. Emotional reactions trigger further chains of thought. Even when external distractions are removed, internal activity continues almost without interruption. From a cognitive perspective, this continuous mental activity constitutes the normal operation of consciousness. From Chopra's perspective, however, it also presents a problem. If intuition depends upon perceiving subtle information, then incessant mental activity may interfere with that perception. The issue is not that thinking is undesirable. Rather, thinking may become sufficiently dominant that quieter forms of awareness are drowned out. Signal and noise. One of Chopra's most useful conceptual tools is borrowed from engineering. Communication systems are often analyzed in terms of the signal-to-noise ratio. The signal is the information one wishes to receive. Noise consists of unwanted interference that obscures the signal. Anyone who has listened to a weak radio station understands the principle intuitively. The broadcast may still be present, but static makes it difficult to hear. Improving reception involves reducing interference rather than increasing the strength of the broadcast itself. Chopra applies this analogy to consciousness. The signal represents intuitive information arising from the universal consciousness field. The noise consists of the continuous stream of internal dialogue that occupies ordinary awareness. This internal dialogue is not inherently harmful. It enables planning, reasoning, problem-solving, and reflection. Indeed, much of civilization depends upon these cognitive capacities. The difficulty arises when the stream of thought becomes so constant that it leaves little room for anything else. If intuition operates quietly, it may simply go unnoticed. According to Chopra's model, meditation does not create intuition. It creates the conditions in which intuition becomes easier to recognize. This distinction is subtle, but important. The information is presumed already to exist. The task is to reduce interference. The space between thoughts. Perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Chopra's explanation concerns what he calls the space between thoughts. At first hearing, the phrase appears paradoxical. Thoughts seem to follow one another so rapidly that they form an almost continuous stream, yet careful observation reveals that consciousness is not completely uninterrupted. There are brief intervals in which no particular thought dominates awareness. Ordinarily, these intervals pass unnoticed because attention immediately attaches itself to the next emerging thought. Meditative practice, Chopra suggests, gradually increases awareness of these intervals. The objective is not to suppress thought through force of will. Attempts to eliminate thinking generally produce frustration and even more mental activity. Instead, the practitioner learns to observe thoughts without becoming entangled in them. As attention settles, the intervals between successive thoughts become more apparent. Within Chopra's framework, these moments of stillness possess special significance. He proposes that the quiet spaces between thoughts are precisely where consciousness becomes most receptive to information originating beyond ordinary mental activity. Again, this is presented as a philosophical interpretation rather than an experimentally verified mechanism. Nevertheless, it offers an elegant conceptual model. Instead of imagining intuition as a mysterious flash arriving from nowhere, intuition becomes the emergence of information into a mind that has temporarily become quiet enough to receive it. Focused attention, rather than passive relaxation, an important misconception should be avoided. The mental stillness described here is not simple relaxation. Relaxation may reduce physical tension, but it does not necessarily cultivate sustained attention. One may be deeply relaxed while simultaneously lost in an endless succession of daydreams. The attentional state Chopra describes is considerably more disciplined. It combines calmness with heightened awareness. In contemporary cognitive science, similar distinctions are sometimes drawn between passive rest and active attentional control. Although the theoretical frameworks differ, both recognize that consciousness can occupy qualitatively different modes of operation. This distinction also explains why meditation often proves more demanding than beginners expect. The challenge lies not in sitting quietly. The challenge lies in maintaining stable attention without becoming absorbed in every passing thought. From Chopra's perspective, this discipline gradually refines consciousness into a more sensitive instrument. Just as a scientific instrument must be carefully calibrated before reliable measurements can be obtained, the mind must likewise be trained if it is to perceive subtle information with greater clarity. Whether one accepts the existence of an Akashic field or regards intuition as an entirely internal cognitive process, the practical implication remains remarkably similar. A quieter, more focused mind is generally better able to detect patterns, recognize subtle associations, and generate insights that might otherwise remain unnoticed. At this point, an interesting convergence begins to emerge. Although Chopra frames the discussion in terms of universal consciousness, many psychologists explain intuitive insight through unconscious cognitive processing. The philosophical interpretations differ, yet both acknowledge that deliberate analytical thought is not the only source of human understanding. The final question, therefore, is not simply whether intuition exists. Few would deny that it does. The more profound question concerns what intuition actually is. Is it merely the product of unconscious neural computation, or does it represent contact with a deeper informational reality extending beyond the individual mind? It is this question that brings us to the broader significance of the AKASHA concept and its enduring place in humanity's attempts to understand consciousness itself. Intuition, consciousness, and the search for knowledge. Whether one accepts the concept of AKASHA literally or regards it as a useful metaphor, it attempts to explain a phenomenon that has intrigued philosophers for millennia: the apparent ability of human beings to know more than they consciously know. Intuition is one of the most familiar yet least understood aspects of cognition. Most people have experienced moments in which the answer to a problem seems to emerge spontaneously, without any conscious process of reasoning. A forgotten name suddenly comes to mind hours after one has stopped trying to remember it. A scientist arrives at an elegant solution after abandoning a difficult calculation. An artist discovers a composition that seems to have appeared almost fully formed. These experiences are commonplace. The disagreement lies not in the experiences themselves but in their interpretation. From the standpoint of contemporary psychology, intuition is generally understood as the product of unconscious information processing. The brain continuously analyzes patterns, forms associations, and evaluates possibilities without conscious awareness. What eventually reaches consciousness is the finished result rather than the intermediate stages of computation. This explanation is supported by a substantial body of cognitive research. Human beings routinely make rapid and remarkably accurate judgments based upon patterns that they cannot consciously articulate. Expertise in fields as diverse as medicine, chess, aviation, and emergency response often depends upon precisely this capacity. Experienced practitioners recognize situations almost instantly because years of accumulated experience have shaped unconscious pattern recognition systems. Within this framework, intuition is not mysterious. It is unconscious cognition becoming conscious. The AKASHA model offers a fundamentally different interpretation. Rather than viewing intuition solely as an internal neurological process, it proposes that consciousness may participate in a broader informational reality extending beyond the individual brain. Intuitive insight in this view represents not merely unconscious computation but the conscious reception of information that already exists within a universal field. These explanations are not simply different answers to the same question. They begin with different assumptions about the nature of consciousness itself. If consciousness is entirely generated by the brain, then intuition must ultimately be explained in neurological terms. If consciousness is more fundamental than the brain, then intuition may involve processes that current neuroscience has yet to describe. At present, neither position has been demonstrated conclusively. The question of evidence. Any serious discussion of AKASHA must distinguish between philosophical speculation and empirical evidence. The concept of an informational field containing the complete history of the universe is intellectually intriguing. It has inspired generations of philosophers, spiritual teachers, and writers. However, inspiration should not be confused with scientific verification. To date, there is no generally accepted empirical evidence demonstrating the existence of an Akashic record, as described within Theosophy or contemporary New Age thought. Similarly, there is no accepted scientific methodology by which such a field can be detected, measured, or independently verified. This does not necessarily prove that the concept is false. Science has repeatedly shown that absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Throughout history, phenomena have existed long before the instruments capable of measuring them were invented. Radio waves, bacteria, and gravitational waves all existed before they were detected. At the same time, intellectual honesty requires recognizing that possibilities remain possibilities until supported by evidence. The AKASHA hypothesis therefore occupies a philosophical rather than an established scientific position. Its value lies in the questions it raises rather than in conclusions that have already been demonstrated. AKASHA as a conceptual model. Even if one remains entirely agnostic regarding its literal existence, the concept of AKASHA possesses considerable value as a conceptual model. It encourages us to think differently about information. Modern civilization increasingly recognizes that information is as fundamental to reality as matter and energy. Biology understands DNA as information encoded chemically. Computer science treats information as something capable of existing independently of any particular machine. Physics increasingly employs informational concepts when describing complex systems. Against this intellectual background, the Akasha concept appears less exotic than it once did. Its terminology may differ, but its central intuition, that information possesses a reality deserving philosophical attention, resonates with several contemporary fields of inquiry. This does not mean that modern information theory validates the Akashic Record. It does suggest that the relationship between information and physical reality has become a legitimate subject of scientific investigation. Whether those investigations will ultimately support, modify, or entirely reject concepts such as AKASHA remains unknown. Universal consciousness revisited. Throughout this chapter, the expression universal consciousness has been preferred to more overtly mystical language. This choice reflects an important conceptual shift. The phrase does not necessarily imply a supernatural entity or a divine intelligence. Rather, it describes the possibility that consciousness may possess dimensions extending beyond individual subjective experience. Some philosophers have explored comparable ideas through panpsychism, which proposes that consciousness, in some form, may be a fundamental feature of reality rather than an accidental byproduct of biological evolution. Others have suggested that consciousness emerges from increasingly complex information processing. Still others argue that consciousness is entirely reducible to neural activity within the brain. These perspectives differ profoundly. Yet they all seek to answer the same enduring question. What is consciousness? The Akasha tradition represents one historical answer among many. Its continuing significance lies not in providing the final solution, but in encouraging us to ask whether consciousness might be larger than our present models allow. Externalizing thought. Within the broader context of the externalization of human thought, the concept of Akasha occupies an especially interesting position. The externalization of human thought explores the many ways in which human beings have imagined thought existing beyond the confines of the individual mind. Writing externalizes memory. Libraries externalize knowledge. Computers externalize calculation. The Internet externalizes collective information. Artificial intelligence externalizes aspects of reasoning and language. The Akashic Record represents another stage in this long intellectual trajectory. It externalizes consciousness itself. Instead of locating all knowledge exclusively within individual brains, it imagines knowledge existing independently of any one person, accessible under particular conditions of awareness. Whether one interprets this literally or metaphorically, it reflects a recurring theme throughout human intellectual history. Again and again, humanity has questioned whether thought is wholly private or whether it participates in something larger. The language has changed across cultures and centuries. The underlying question has remained remarkably constant. Akasha in the information age. One of the reasons the concept of Akasha continues to attract attention is that the world has gradually become more comfortable with the idea that information can exist independently of any single physical object. For most of human history, information appeared inseparable from its medium. A story existed only while someone spoke it. A law existed only when inscribed on stone. A book could be read only by those who possessed the physical manuscript. Knowledge was localized. The digital revolution fundamentally altered this intuition. Today, very few people think twice about accessing information that is physically stored thousands of kilometers away. A document may reside in a data center on another continent, yet it appears instantaneously on a mobile phone. The user rarely considers where the information actually exists. What matters is that it can be retrieved when required. Cloud computing has transformed our everyday understanding of information. We have become accustomed to treating information as something that exists independently of any particular device. A laptop may fail, yet the documents remain available because they were never truly stored in the computer itself. In one sense, this technological development has made the Akashic metaphor considerably easier to understand. The Akashic Record proposes that information exists independently of individual minds. Cloud computing demonstrates that information can indeed exist independently of individual devices. The analogy should not be pushed too far. Digital cloud storage is a human-engineered technological system, whereas the Akashic Record is proposed as a fundamental feature of reality itself. Nevertheless, the comparison illustrates an important conceptual point. Information need not be tied permanently to a single physical location. This is an idea that would have appeared extraordinary only a century ago, but has become entirely ordinary today. The significance of this shift extends beyond technology. It has altered how we think about knowledge itself. Distributed information. Modern science increasingly studies systems in which information is distributed rather than centralized. The Internet possesses no single location containing all its information. Biological organisms do not rely upon one cell to store every instruction necessary for life. Even the human brain appears to distribute memories across complex networks, rather than storing them in a single anatomical location. Complex systems often exhibit behavior that cannot be understood by examining individual components in isolation. Information resides within patterns of organization. This observation has profound philosophical implications. It encourages us to think less about objects and more about relationships. The Akashic concept similarly invites us to imagine information as a property of reality itself, rather than as something confined within individual minds. Whether this represents physical reality remains unknown. As a conceptual model, however, it aligns surprisingly well with the modern movement away from strictly localized explanations. Collective intelligence. Another modern idea bearing comparison is collective intelligence. No single scientist understands all of modern science. No individual engineer comprehends every aspect of the Internet. No physician possesses the entirety of medical knowledge. Instead, knowledge exists collectively. Civilization itself functions as a distributed cognitive system. Libraries, universities, scientific journals, databases, and artificial intelligence systems together form an external network of accumulated human understanding. Each individual contributes only a tiny fraction. The whole vastly exceeds the sum of its individual participants. This observation echoes one of the central themes of this book. Human thought has progressively externalized itself. Writing allowed memory to survive the death of the individual. Printing multiplied knowledge. Digital technology accelerated its dissemination. Artificial intelligence now extends access to that accumulated information in unprecedented ways. The Akashic Record represents an earlier philosophical attempt to imagine precisely this externalization. Instead of books preserving human knowledge, reality itself performs the preservation. Instead of libraries storing information, the universe becomes the library. Whether interpreted literally or metaphorically, the underlying intellectual movement is remarkably similar. Knowledge becomes larger than the individual mind. Predictive processing and intuition. One of the most influential developments in contemporary cognitive science is the theory known as predictive processing. According to this framework, the brain functions not as a passive recorder of sensory information, but as an active prediction machine. At every moment, it continuously generates hypotheses about the world and compares them with incoming sensory evidence. Perception itself becomes an ongoing process of prediction and correction. This theory has transformed how many neuroscientists understand cognition. It also provides an intriguing perspective on intuition. From the predictive processing viewpoint, intuitive insight may occur when unconscious predictive models suddenly converge upon an accurate solution. The individual experiences the conclusion without becoming aware of the countless intermediate calculations. The insight appears instantaneous. The computation has been occurring all along. This explanation differs fundamentally from the Akashic model. Predictive processing locates the entire process within the brain. The Akashic model proposes that at least some information may originate beyond the individual brain. Interestingly, both theories agree on one important point. The conscious mind is not the sole source of understanding. Much of what eventually reaches awareness has already undergone extensive processing elsewhere. Where they disagree is over where that elsewhere should be located. Consciousness beyond the brain? The greatest difference between conventional neuroscience and the AKASHA hypothesis concerns the nature of consciousness itself. Most neuroscientific models assume that consciousness emerges from sufficiently complex neural activity. Damage the brain, and consciousness changes accordingly. Alter neurochemistry, and subjective experience changes with it. These observations strongly support the intimate relationship between brain function and conscious awareness. Advocates of universal consciousness do not necessarily dispute these findings. Instead, they interpret them differently. They argue that the brain may function less like a generator and more like an interface. A useful analogy is the relationship between a television receiver and a broadcast signal. Damaging the television certainly degrades the picture. That fact alone does not prove that the television created the broadcast. It demonstrates only that the receiver is necessary for displaying it. Similarly, proponents of universal consciousness suggest that injury to the brain may impair consciousness without proving that consciousness originates exclusively within the brain. This analogy remains speculative. It should not be mistaken for scientific evidence. Nevertheless, it illustrates an important philosophical distinction. Correlation does not necessarily establish causation. Whether consciousness is generated by the brain or mediated through it remains one of the most profound unanswered questions in both neuroscience and philosophy. AKASHA and artificial intelligence. The emergence of artificial intelligence introduces another fascinating comparison. Large language models do not possess human consciousness. Yet they demonstrate something historically unprecedented. Knowledge can now be externalized to such an extent that machines can participate in reasoning, summarization, translation, and creative assistance. The information utilized by these systems is not stored in the mind of any single programmer. Instead, it emerges from vast, distributed networks of data and statistical relationships. This development reinforces one of the central themes of the externalization of thought. Human civilization has progressively transferred cognitive functions into external systems. Memory became books. Calculation became computers. Communication became the internet. Reasoning itself is increasingly assisted by artificial intelligence. From this perspective, the Akashic Record appears less as an isolated mystical doctrine than as one expression of a recurring human intuition. Again and again, humanity imagines knowledge existing beyond the individual mind. Sometimes that external repository is divine. Sometimes it is a library. Sometimes it is the cloud. Sometimes it is an artificial intelligence model. Sometimes it is the Akashic field. The proposed mechanisms differ dramatically. The underlying intuition remains strikingly constant. An enduring question, perhaps the enduring importance of AKASHA, lies not in whether it proves literally true, but in the question it compels us to ask. Is consciousness fundamentally private, existing only within individual brains? Or does each mind participate, in ways not yet fully understood, in a larger informational reality? Modern science has not answered this question. Neither has philosophy. Neither has spirituality. The concept of AKASHA, therefore, occupies an unusual place in the history of ideas. It stands at the intersection of metaphysics, psychology, information theory, and the philosophy of mind. It reminds us that the deepest questions about consciousness are also questions about information. How is information created? How is it preserved? How is it accessed? And perhaps the most profound question of all, is thought something the mind produces, or something with which the mind participates? It is this question, rather than any particular answer, that gives the concept of AKASHA its continuing intellectual significance. Conclusion. The journey of AKASHA from ancient India to contemporary discussions of consciousness illustrates how ideas evolve rather than remain static. In its earliest form, AKASHA referred principally to space, the subtle dimension within which existence unfolds. Theosophy transformed it into the Akashic Record, a universal repository preserving every event and every experience. Contemporary New Age writers, including Deepak Chopra, reframed it once again, presenting it as an informational field connected with universal consciousness and explored through intuition, focused attention, and meditative stillness. Each stage reflects the intellectual concerns of its own era. Ancient philosophers sought to understand the structure of reality. Theosophists sought a synthesis of Eastern and Western wisdom. Modern writers increasingly seek a language capable of bridging spirituality, psychology, and science. Whether the Akashic field ultimately proves to be an objective feature of reality, a sophisticated philosophical metaphor, or simply an imaginative framework for understanding intuition remains an open question. What cannot be denied is its enduring influence. For more than a century, the concept has shaped discussions of consciousness, creativity, memory, and the origin of knowledge. It continues to inspire inquiry precisely because it addresses questions that remain unresolved. How does genuine insight arise? What is the relationship between information and consciousness? Can the mind know more than it can consciously explain? These questions remain among the deepest in philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience. The concept of AKASHA does not settle them. It reminds us that the search for answers has taken many forms, and that humanity's attempt to understand consciousness is far from complete. Whether future discoveries ultimately affirm or refute the idea of a universal consciousness field, the intellectual journey that produced the concept of AKASHA remains an important chapter in the history of human thought.
The author has placed this work in the public domain. It may be freely imported, exported, shared, distributed, edited, modified, or reformatted without explicit consent from the author. As a visually impaired person, the author asserts his rights under the Marrakesh Treaty to facilitate access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled. 2013, wipo.int.
Early bird registration for my September 5th event is valid until July 31st for a minimum donation of 150 ringgit. Made before July 31st, you can attend my September 5th event. All proceeds for all your donations will be used not just for your meal for the day, but also for my various eye treatments and sponsoring some persons with disability to attend the event. From July onwards, it will be 150 ringgit until the end of July. Then in August, it will go up to 200 ringgit. Thank you.
How to attend AZLAN Adnan's Meet the Author Luncheon at the Hungry Tapir, 135 Petaling Street, Kuala Lumpur, short walking distance from the Pasar Seni MRT LRT station, from 12:30 hours, Saturday, 5th September 2026.
Step 1. Download all my 30+ books on nutrition for free from Z Library using this URL. However, there is a limit of 10 downloads a day from Z Library. The workaround is to download them, and 2,250 plus others, from my Optimal Health Community Telegram broadcast channel at EPUB Electronic Publishing. All my free ebooks are published in .EPUB electronic publishing format. If you are still living in the dark ages and only know .PDF, portable document format, and never heard of .EPUB, don't worry. You are about to have a mind-blowing experiential learning journey. If you use an Apple device, .EPUB files open in the Books app. If you are an Android user, use Universal Book Reader or a similar app. If you need further instructions on how to read .EPUB documents, just ask your favorite AI app to teach you. If you have never used an AI app before, start with Grok, Gemini, or ChatGPT. Then move on to DeepSeek, Claude, or Kling later.
Step 2. I have put all my books in the public domain, and you may share them freely. In fact, I strongly implore you to do so. Viralize them, make sure they reach every person who needs the knowledge contained in them. In Malaysia, the most recent data from the National Health and Morbidity Survey 2023 shows that 21.8% of adults are obese and 32.6% are overweight. This means the total combined rate is 54.4% of adults. Scary huge percentages of Malaysians are diabetic or suffer from other non-communicable diseases, NCDs. To be specific, in Malaysia, about 15.5% of adults have chronic kidney disease, CKD, up from 9.1% in 2011. Around 21.4% of adults aged 30 and above are at high risk of cardiovascular disease, CVD. Among older adults, about 8.5% have dementia, equating to roughly 260,000 people as of 2022. A nation is only as strong as its human capital. How strong can a nation be if more than half its population is fat, sick, and nearly dead? Of what good can you be to your family if you are fat, sick, and nearly dead? You owe it to yourself to be the best version of yourself that you can possibly be.
Step 3. Read the books. Follow whatever advice that makes sense to you. If something doesn't make sense to you, or causes cognitive dissonance, you can ask me clarifying questions on the 5th of September. Also, be prepared to report on the 5th of September what improvements in your health you have noticed. So far, one person has seen her total cholesterol level drop from always above 5 to 4.6. Another has resolved a chronic constipation issue. I have written 2 books on human stool classification and stool analysis. Another person who wakes up every morning with a white layer of mucus on her tongue for more than half her life now wakes up with a clear tongue. Step 4. Make the minimum donation by the required dates. The longer you prevaricate, the higher the minimum donation gets. Minimum donation per pax: 100 ringgit for donations received by June 30th, 150 ringgit for donations received by July 31st, 200 ringgit for donations received by August 31st, 500 ringgit for donations received by the 5th of September and for walk-ins. Places are limited. However, I do not wish to deprive anyone. If enough people register, we can take over the whole restaurant, so make your donations early to reserve your place. Purpose: your donations will go towards sponsoring persons with disability, PWD, to attend the event, and also towards my various ongoing eye treatments. Sponsorship: if you run a business and wish to promote your business, you can sponsor door gifts, gift vouchers, or even cash.
Vegivore Food Therapy proudly presents Ask Me Anything on Nutrition.
Your attention please. Vegivore Food Therapy proudly organizes a unique, transformative event on Saturday, 5 September 2026, starting at 12:30 hours at the Hungry Tapir, 135 Jalan Petaling Street, 50000, Kuala Lumpur. For a minimum donation of 100 ringgit, attendees will secure a seat at this rare opportunity. AZLAN ADNAN, MA, polymath and autodidact, will guide the session. A writer and researcher in nutrition science, AZLAN has authored dozens of books on plant-based bioactives, antioxidants, and the chemistry of whole foods. In this session, he will lead a dynamic Ask Me Anything on Nutrition session. All 30 of his nutrition books are in the public domain and are downloadable at the link below. Attendees must read these books in advance and come prepared with their questions. This is a singular chance to engage with one of today's leading independent nutrition thinkers. Don't miss it. A healthy, whole food, plant-based lunch with the menu curated by AZLAN ADNAN will be served. No need to write your name in the reference of the bank transfer, as it will automatically be displayed, but include your phone number in case we need to contact you for any last-minute changes.
We will also celebrate AZLAN's 68th birthday.
Some of you have been wondering why a YouTube channel devoted to green political philosophy and ideology would address health issues. The stark facts are these. Data from the National Health and Morbidity Survey Malaysia 2023 shows that 54.4% of adults are either overweight or obese, with 32.6% classified as overweight and 21.8% as obese. Abdominal obesity, per Roy, was also reported at 54.5%. Compared to 2011, the combined prevalence of overweight and obesity has increased from 44.5% to 54.4%. According to the same survey, 15.6% of adults in Malaysia have been diagnosed with diabetes, kencing manis. Additionally, about 21.4% of Malaysian adults aged 30 and above have a high 10-year calculated risk of developing cardiovascular disease, CVD, sakit jantung. In Malaysia, precise prevalence data for diagnosed CVD is somewhat limited. Data from 2010 to 2021 indicated that 16.6% of all registered deaths were due to CVD. A 2015 survey found that 14.1% of working-age adults had diabetes, 24.5% had hypertension, and 45.9% had high cholesterol. The World Heart Federation also noted in 2022 that around 11% of deaths in Malaysia are linked to CVD. In 2011, the prevalence of chronic kidney disease, CKD, sakit buah pinggang, was 9.07%. A nationwide study in Malaysia in 2018 estimated that 15.48% of adults, over 5 million people, have CKD. It really is alarming. These numbers are striking, especially when you consider how rapidly they have grown over just a decade. It is a massive public health challenge. In light of these statistics, the implications for nation building and capacity building are stark. What value does a nation have if more than half its population are fat, sick, and nearly dead?
Are you fat, sick, and nearly dead? Well, according to the data from the latest survey, 54.8% of Malaysians are. In fact, the statistics are quite scary. So if you or any of your loved ones are in this high-risk category, don't despair. I have good news for you. I've written more than 30 books on nutrition, and you can download them all for free. The only limitation is you can only download 10 books per day from Z Library. However, you can download almost 2,500 books from my Telegram broadcast channel. I'll give you the link shortly. And if you're overwhelmed by 30 books, in fact, these 30 books, I've designed them so that they could cover the undergraduate syllabus of a nutrition or dietetics course, or the nutritional needs for a medical student. Anyway, if you think you're overwhelmed, you don't know where to start with this book. And then as you progress, you can, go deeper, take a deep dive into the other books. And if you want to meet me to discuss what you've read in the books, you have a chance in September to do so. However, there are 5 places already been taken up, and there are limited seats, so the sooner you register, the sooner you'll reserve a place for yourself. Attendance is by donation, so details are in the following video.
It is for this reason that I've written more than 30 books on health and nutrition and put them all in the public domain. Why nutrition? Because nutrition is the single biggest factor and lowest hanging fruit we can address to improve our health. 80% of our health is influenced by nutrition, which is our biggest exposure to the environment. The others are genetics, at 5%. But even with genetics, the emerging science of epigenetics shows how we can switch off bad genes and switch on good ones with nutrition. The remaining 15% relate to other lifestyle factors, including sleep, meditation, relationships, air quality, and so forth.
Important note on event registration fees. Super Early Bird. Donation received by the 30th of June 2026. Minimum donation of 100 ringgits. Early Bird. Donation received between the 1st and the 31st of July 2026. Minimum donation of 150 ringgits. Normal registration. Donation received between the 1st and the 31st of August 2026. Minimum donation of 200 ringgits. Late registration. Donation received between 1st to 5th September 2026. Minimum donation of 500 ringgits. All proceeds after deducting third-party costs will go towards AZLAN Adnan's various ongoing eye treatments to hopefully reverse or at least arrest his macular degeneration, cataracts, photophobia, mydriasis, dry eyes, and etc. This is mission critical as, if his vision fails, he'll no longer be able to produce, edit, or upload videos. Your voluntary contributions and donations are a critical success factor. As such, your generosity, empathy, compassion, and kindness are well and truly appreciated. We thank you in advance for your invaluable help and assistance in making this event a resounding success.
About the author. AZLAN Adnan, M.A., is a writer and independent researcher whose work focuses on nutrition science, food systems, and the biological foundations of human health. His writing examines how natural foods contain complex compounds that interact with human physiology in ways that may support long-term well-being. He has a particular interest in plant-based bioactive compounds such as polyphenols, carotenoids, flavonoids, and other phytochemicals found in fruits, vegetables, herbs, spices, algae, and fungi. His research explores how these compounds function in plants and how they may influence human nutrition when consumed as part of a balanced diet. AZLAN approaches nutrition from a multidisciplinary perspective, drawing on biochemistry, plant biology, and public health nutrition. His work aims to translate complex scientific concepts into clear explanations so that readers can better understand the nutritional value of everyday foods. He is the author of several books examining natural sources of antioxidants and other dietary compounds. Author of the Antioxidant series, Antioxidants in Herbs and Spices, Antioxidants in Algae, Microalgae, and Fungi, Antioxidants in Fruits and Vegetables, Antioxidants in Nuts and Seeds, Antioxidants in Berries. Author of the Nutrient series, Macronutrients, Volume 1, Carbohydrates, Macronutrients, Volume 2, Lipids, Macronutrients, Volume 3, Proteins, Micronutrients, Vitamins, Trace Elements, and Minerals, Anti-nutrients, the hidden blockers in your food, Phytonutrients, the quiet power of plants, Water, the forgotten fourth, a macronutrient you can't ignore. Other books on health and nutrition. Tuber's briefing paper, 2nd edition. AZLAN's 5-Powder Manifesto. Eating the Greek Way, how cultural habits support health without trying. Ideology on a Plate, how Robert F. Kennedy Jr. turned U.S. dietary guidelines into a scientific farce. Maslow in 2026, a practical guide to actual needs, not scrollable wishes. These works form part of an ongoing series exploring the chemistry, biological roles, and nutritional significance of bioactive compounds in plant foods. Through his writing, AZLAN advocates a practical food-first approach to nutrition. His work emphasizes whole foods, dietary diversity, and balanced eating patterns, rather than reliance on isolated nutrients or supplements. He holds a Master of Arts in International Business and Management from the University of Westminster in London, and writes extensively on nutrition science, health, and food-based approaches to long-term well-being. AZLAN Adnan, the quiet revolutionary of real food writing. AZLAN Adnan, M.A., is a Malaysian polymath who spent decades turning food into philosophy. Raw, unfiltered, no hype. You won't find him pushing superfoods or miracle diets. He dissects what actually works. Whole plants, spices, microbes, and the quiet chemistry that keeps bodies humming. With over 30 books, self-published, shared freely on Z Library, Facebook groups, Telegram channels, AZLAN's output is prolific. Part manifesto, part manual. Early works like Spring Has Sprung, a psychological thriller, and travelogues on the road to the East Coast reveal his roots in journalism, advertising, and storytelling. But nutrition became his mission. Educated with a Master of Arts in International Business and Management from the University of Westminster, London, he taught at the School of Management, Royal Holloway, London, while pursuing doctoral research in business strategy and environmental management, specializing in the international timber trade. That academic backbone, rigor, systems thinking, sustainability, bleeds into his food writing. No fluff, just evidence. The core series, the Macronutrients Trilogy, Volume 1 on carbohydrates, glucose, fiber, metabolism, Volume 2 on lipids, fats, omega-3s, inflammation. Volume 3 on proteins, repair, enzymes, muscle. Then micronutrients, water, and anti-nutrients, the plant world's double-edged sword. Anti-nutrients are naturally occurring compounds in whole foods, phytates, oxalates, lectins, goitrogens, that can bind minerals, block enzymes, or mess with absorption. They evolved as plant defenses, but in us, they steal iron from spinach, calcium from kale, or spike gut irritation from raw beans. Variety wins. 30 plants a week, not monodiets. Raw's romantic, but cooked smarter. Add spice blends like AZLAN's 5-powder manifesto, turmeric mixes for real anti-inflammation, and you've got a library that says, eat wide, not weird. Why release it all into the public domain? Because knowledge isn't currency. It's oxygen. AZLAN watched corporations gatekeep health, paywalls on papers, patented supplements, proprietary blends that hide what works. He refuses. His books aren't for sale. They're for spread. No DRM, no ads, no ego. Just files anyone can download, print, share. He says it plain. If one person in a kampong swaps white rice for brown or steams kailan instead of boiling it, that's the win, not royalties. He's no gatekeeper. His Facebook, AZLAN Green Party, Instagram, and YouTube drop bite-sized truths. Traffic light WFPB guides, eye health talks on lutein, vegan journeys. He credits tradition, curries, forest mushrooms, seaweed from tides, and lives it. Unpeeled carrots, home ferments, no moralizing. 30-plus titles aren't about volume. They're depth. Carbs to phytonutrients, water to gut bugs. AZLAN doesn't sell health. He hands you the tools. Read him and your plate changes. Not because you're broken, because you're built for better. A heartfelt light. To every soul whose hand did give, you've helped me dream, helped me live. In darkest hours your light came through, with hearts so kind, so pure, so true. Your gifts, like stars in deepest night, have steered me gently toward the light. Each coin, each word, each silent prayer, a thread of hope so rich, so rare. My eyes once dimmed now seek the skies, and slowly clearer visions rise. Because of you, I dare to see the world again. Its grace, its plea. Your compassion's flame will not just stay with me alone. It lights the way for others wandering through despair to feel the warmth of selfless care. You've shown what love in action means, in quiet ways through giving scenes. You've built a bridge from soul to soul and made the broken feel more whole. So let this thanks rise like a song, a melody both soft and strong. May your example gently call more hearts to rise to give. To fall into the joy of lifting pain, of planting hope where none remains. Your kindness walks beside me still, a light, a love, a living will.
subscribe button to show your support. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to show your support.